The last transmission lasted 11 seconds, 3 shots, a pause that stretched like a held breath, then 3 more. After that, nothing. Just static, wind, and the slow certainty spreading through Iron Ridge Command Center that an entire reconnaissance squad had been swallowed alive by the Karakoram Mountains. The rescue window was closing. Satellites showed white. Thermal drones showed white. Every experienced operator in that room had already made peace with the loss, already started composing the kind of sentences nobody ever wants to write. Then the quietest person in the building raised her hand. If this story reaches you, follow, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The blizzard had been moving east for 3 days before anyone at Iron Ridge Command decided it was bad enough to officially classify as a threat to field operations. By the time the weather advisory was updated, Recon Team Viper was already 12 kilometers into the high passes, running a surveillance sweep along a supply corridor that the Intelligence Division had flagged as a possible insurgent resupply route. The mission parameters were straightforward: observe, record, extract. No engagement unless fired upon, backed by 0400. They never came back. The last confirmed position check put them at a ridgeline designated Point Kestrel, a narrow ledge of exposed rock at roughly 4,800 meters, wind exposure on 3 sides, exactly the kind of place a patrol leader would use for a short halt before pushing through to the descent route. After that, the radio went dark. Not gradually, not with interference or degrading signal quality the way comms sometimes died in the mountains. It just stopped. One transmission, then nothing, as if someone had reached out and unplugged the whole world. The base operations watch officer, Captain Drew Hallen, logged the blackout at 0217 and waited 18 minutes before escalating. Standard protocol allowed for temporary communication gaps in extreme weather. The Karakoram had a way of eating radio signals the same way it ate everything else. By 0300, when the backup frequency also produced nothing but static, Hallen called the duty commander. Commander Nathan Cross arrived in the operations center at 0312, wearing yesterday's uniform and the particular expression of a man who had already been awake too long and knew his night was not about to improve. He reviewed the logs, studied the weather feeds, pulled up the last satellite pass over the sector, an image so thick with cloud cover it was essentially useless, and made 3 phone calls in rapid succession. By 0400, the command floor was full. The building itself felt different at that hour. The overhead fluorescence always seemed harsher after midnight, the kind of flat, institutional light that made everyone look tired even when they weren't. Maps and satellite imagery covered every available surface. 3 analysts worked adjacent terminals in near silence, cross-referencing terrain overlays with the patrol's planned route. 2 senior NCOs stood near the back wall speaking quietly, with the look on their faces that came from experience, the look of men who were mentally preparing themselves for a specific kind of morning. Evelyn Shaw was at her workstation in the far corner. She was always at her workstation in the far corner. That was part of it, part of how people understood her, or rather how they didn't. She'd been at Iron Ridge for 7 months, attached to the intelligence section as a terrain and road analysis specialist, and in 7 months she had managed to become simultaneously essential and invisible. Her reports were accurate. Her mapping work was meticulous. She had twice flagged route vulnerabilities that turned out to be real, both times through careful interpretation of topographic data rather than any flashy intelligence collection. Nobody had thanked her for either flag, because by the time the reports were incorporated into planning documents, the authorship had blurred through several layers of review. She was 31 years old, wore wire-framed glasses that she'd repaired herself at some point, with a small piece of adhesive tape on the left hinge, and tended to speak in the measured, slightly too careful way of someone who had learned early that people stopped listening when she got excited. She was not particularly loud. She was not particularly imposing. She was, to most people in the building, the analyst who made the maps look good. "Tell me what we have from the route overlay," Cross said from the center of the room, addressing the room in general. Senior analyst Brecker answered. He usually answered Cross's room general questions, had a talent for positioning himself where the answers naturally flowed through him. Planned route puts them moving northeast along the secondary ridgeline from Point Kestrel toward the Ashkar descent corridor. Weather moved faster than forecast. If they were on that ridgeline when the storm hit the upper elevation band, visibility would have dropped to under 5 meters inside of 20 minutes. Enemy contact? Possible. The sector's been active. We had a pattern of life flag on that corridor 2 weeks ago. Low confidence, but it's there. Search and rescue posture? Staff Sergeant Dodd, the unit's senior rescue coordinator, looked up from his terminal with the kind of expression that didn't need interpretation. Sir, I've got 2 rotary assets that can launch when weather clears. Current forecast puts the upper passes below minimums for at least another 4 hours, possibly 6. Ground team insertion into that sector in present conditions is... He paused, selected his word carefully. Not advisable. Not advisable, Cross repeated. We'd be putting a rescue element at the same risk level as the missing team, worse probably, without their head start on rote knowledge. Cross stood in front of the main display and stared at it the way soldiers stare at problems they can't shoot. The map showed the last known position, the dead radio contact point, the weather overlay pressing down from the north like a gray ceiling falling. Viper team had 6 personnel. The patrol leader was First Sergeant Dale Crow, 14 years in, 2 combat deployments, a man who knew mountains and knew fieldcraft and knew exactly how to keep himself and his people alive in situations that would end most careers. If Crow's team had gone silent, the silence meant something serious. What's the probability we're looking at a complete loss? Cross asked. He wasn't asking anyone specifically. He was thinking out loud, which was something he did when the math was bad, and he needed to hear the numbers spoken. Dodd answered anyway. Given the weather conditions, the communication blackout duration, and the lack of any activation on emergency beacons, he stopped. Hi, sir. We have to consider it. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something awful becomes plausible. That was when Evelyn spoke. I need to play the last transmission again. Nobody answered immediately. She was already pulling up the audio file, had been pulling it up actually for the last several minutes while the conversation played out around her. She ran it through the room speakers without waiting for permission, which was not something she typically did, and the sound of it changed the atmosphere immediately. Sharp static, the distant howl of high-altitude wind, and beneath it, barely audible, the rhythm of gunfire. 3 shots. A pause. 3 more. The room's attention shifted to her terminal, then to her. Brecker looked faintly annoyed at the interruption. Cross turned from the display. What exactly are we listening for, Shaw? The spacing. She adjusted the playback speed, slowing it slightly, and ran it again. Listen to the gap between the sets. It's not random fire. The interval between those 2 groups is too consistent. 4.2 seconds, both times the transmission was recorded. In a firefight, random fire doesn't produce that kind of spacing. You're running on adrenaline, you're moving, weapon handling gets rough. 4.2 seconds twice in a row in the same conditions means someone was controlling their trigger deliberately. Brecker let the silence sit for about 3 seconds before he responded. That's a stretch, Shaw. It's a distress signal, she said. 3 shots. Pause. 3 shots. It's the oldest field signal in the manual. Someone on that team was still functional enough to send it, which means someone survived the initial contact. Or it's coincidence. 4.2 seconds. Twice. She said it the same way she'd said it before. Not louder, not harder, just the number sitting there being what it was. One of the NCOs near the back wall made a sound that might have been skepticism or might have been a suppressed cough. Dodd studied his terminal. Cross looked at Evelyn with the particular expression of someone who was not quite dismissing her, but was also not fully committing to taking her seriously. That careful middle distance that commanders sometimes maintained when they weren't sure which direction the evidence was pointing. Even if you're right, Cross said, that doesn't change our search posture. We can't put assets into those conditions. I know where they are, Evelyn said. The room shifted again. You know, Brecker said flatly, I've been studying this sector for 4 months. Every ridge, every drainage, every natural shelter within the patrol's operating area. She stood up from her terminal, which was unusual enough that it drew attention by itself, and moved to the main terrain display. She didn't wait for anyone to give her the pointer. She picked it up off the table. Here's Point Kestrel. Here's the Ashkar descent. If they took contact on this ridgeline, which is the most exposed stretch of the route, most likely ambush position for anyone who'd done route reconnaissance, their options were limited. Moving northeast puts them further into the kill zone. Moving southwest takes them back toward the ambush. Moving west is a cliff face. She moved the pointer north. The only viable cover move is uphill, north-northwest toward the Vrock high ground, which puts them here. She indicated a contour cluster well above the patrol's planned route, a dense tangle of elevation lines that indicated steep, irregular terrain. There's a geothermal feature in this area, a cave system. I found it in a 1970s Soviet geological survey of the range. It wouldn't appear on any current military mapping because it's not in our database, but it's there. And if someone on that team was trained to read terrain under pressure, that cave would be the only warm shelter within 4 kilometers of the contact point. The pointer came to rest on a blank-looking section of the map that nobody in the room had ever looked at twice. "You're basing this on a Soviet geological survey," Brecker said. "I'm basing it on the terrain," Evelyn said. "The survey just told me where to look." Cross studied the map for a long moment. "Shaw, even if your analysis is correct, we cannot authorize a ground insertion in current conditions. I explained that." "I'm not asking for authorization." Another silence, different quality this time. "I'll go alone," she said. The laughter came from 2 places simultaneously, one of the NCOs near the back wall, and an analyst 2 terminals down from Brecker. It wasn't cruel, exactly. It was the kind of laughter that emerges when a situation produces something so far outside expected parameters that the only available response is involuntary. The map girl, the terrain analyst with the taped glasses, and the Soviet geological surveys, going alone into the high Karakoram in a Category 4 blizzard to find a missing reconnaissance team. "Shaw!" Cross's voice was patient in the way commanding officers were patient when they needed to redirect someone without creating a scene. "I appreciate the analysis. I do. But what you're describing—" "Sergeant Crow's team has been in those conditions for over 6 hours," Evelyn said. "If the wounded are still alive, they've got maybe 4 more. 6 if they found shelter. Every hour we wait for the weather window to clear." She stopped, recalculated, said it directly. "People are going to die while we wait for conditions to become comfortable." "You're a terrain analyst," Brecker said. "You're not—" "I know the terrain," she said, "better than anyone in this room. Knowing the terrain on a map and moving through it in a blizzard aren't the same thing." She looked at him steadily. "No," she said, "they're not." It wasn't a concession, it was something else. The flat acknowledgement of a fact that didn't change her position at all. Cross studied her. In 7 months of working with Evelyn Shaw, he had never once seen her push back on anything. She submitted her reports, answered questions with precision, never argued over methodology or recognition, never made the kind of noise that drew attention to herself in situations like this. Whatever was happening right now was something different, and something about the quality of her stillness. The way she was standing, the way she wasn't performing anything for the room, made him hesitate before responding. "Give me one reason," he said quietly. "One reason I should believe you can do this." She reached into the folder she'd brought with her from her workstation. She'd had it ready before she'd ever spoken, he realized, and set 3 documents on the table. A topographic analysis report, a weather modeling overlay she'd apparently run herself, and a route plan, handwritten on standard field notation paper, broken into leg times bearing changes, hazard markers. She'd already planned the route. "I've been running the terrain model since the blackout started," she said. "I've got a route that avoids the primary avalanche corridors, uses the natural wind shadows for navigation reference, and hits the geothermal area in approximately 4.5 hours at conservative pace." She paused. "I leave now. I'm there before dawn." Cross picked up the route plan, looked at it, looked at her. "Shaw, if I'm wrong," she said, "you've lost 1 analyst. If I'm right, and we wait, you've lost 6 soldiers." Nobody laughed this time. Cross looked at the map for a long time, long enough that the room became uncomfortable with the weight of the decision, long enough that Dodd quietly picked up Evelyn's route plan and started reading it, and 2 of the NCOs moved closer to look at the terrain overlay, and Brecker crossed his arms and stared at the display with an expression that was 3/4 skepticism and something else he wasn't putting a name to. You understand what you're walking into, Cross said finally. It wasn't really a question. Yes, sir. If you go past the wire and we lose contact with you, then I'll use the same signal Crow's team used, she said. 3 shots, 4-second pause, 3 more. You'll know where to look. Cross set the route plan down, picked up his radio, made 2 calls in rapid succession, one to the duty armorer, one to the equipment cage, and when he was done, he looked at Evelyn with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Standard field kit, radio, sidearm, emergency locator, cold weather package. You check in every 45 minutes, or I send whatever I can into that weather to find you. Understood. You come back, he said. That's not a suggestion. She nodded once, gathered her documents, and walked out of the operations center without hurrying. Behind her, the room sat in the particular silence of a group of people who had just watched something they weren't sure how to categorize. Something that sat somewhere between extraordinary confidence and complete recklessness, and none of them could say with certainty which side of the line it fell on. Brecker was still staring at the door 30 seconds after she'd gone through it. She's going to get herself killed, he said. Nobody disagreed. But nobody agreed either, which in its own way was something. The armory was staffed at that hour by Corporal Yates, a 23-year-old from somewhere flat in the Midwest who looked perpetually startled by his own existence. He handed over the sidearm and the radio without asking questions. The order had come through proper channels, which meant it was above his pay grade to have an opinion, but he watched Evelyn check the weapon with the kind of practiced efficiency that didn't quite match the image of the person holding it, and something in his expression shifted. Cold weather kit's in the cage, he said. He stopped, started over. You sure about this? The kit, she said. He got the kit. The equipment cage was 3 rooms down, a long, narrow space with metal shelving floor to ceiling, the kind of room that smelled like nylon and machine oil and the particular institutional staleness of stored gear. Evelyn moved through it quickly, pulling items with the kind of methodical speed that came from a checklist that existed in her head rather than in her hands. High loft insulated base layer, wind-blocking outer shell, gaiters, mountaineering gloves, 2 pairs, the field-grade crampons, not the trail version, the full aggressive ice set that required real practice to use without injuring yourself, a compact ice axe, emergency bivouac kit, high-calorie ration pack. She checked the radio twice, tested the locator beacon, loaded the sidearm, chambered around, holstered it cleanly. At the equipment cage door, she paused for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to check the weather display on the wall screen, which showed the blizzard exactly as she expected it to. The front holding steady. Visibility in the upper passes essentially 0. Temperatures at altitude somewhere around -30 with wind chill. Long enough to look at the terrain map one more time and trace the route in her mind the way she'd been tracing it for the past hour and a half. She had not told anyone in the operations room about the tracker. The man who taught her, the one she'd grown up calling simply Old Vasek, a retired wilderness guide who'd spent his life in the mountains of a very different range on a very different continent, had a particular saying she'd never been able to translate cleanly into English. The rough version was something like, "The mountain tells you everything, but only if you stop asking it questions and start listening to what it's already saying." He'd taught her to read snowpack by sound, the way compressed wind snow rang differently when tapped than settled powder, the way ice-crusted surfaces under fresh accumulation gave a specific hollow pitch when you crossed them. He'd taught her to navigate by the behavior of wind against terrain features when visibility dropped to nothing. Nobody here knew that. Nobody here knew any of it, because nobody here had ever asked her anything about herself except where she'd gotten her geography degree. She pulled up her hood, checked the compass on her wrist, confirmed the bearing to the first leg of her route. Then she stepped outside. The cold hit her like a wall, not gradually. All at once, the way a door closing seals the warm world behind you and replaces it with something that is not interested in your comfort. The wind was already running at probably 60 kilometers an hour at base elevation, gusting higher, carrying snow horizontally in sheets that caught the perimeter lights and turned them into pale smears. Within 20 steps of the wire, the operations center behind her vanished into white noise and dark. She oriented herself by the slope angle under her feet and the pressure of the wind against her left side, and she walked into the blizzard the same way she did everything, quietly, methodically, without the luxury of waiting for conditions to become easier. Above her, somewhere in the dark and the white and the screaming wind, a soldier was still alive. She was as certain of it as she'd been of anything in her professional life, and she held that certainty the way you hold something fragile in bad weather, carefully, with both hands close to the body. The mountain rose ahead of her, and she rose with it, and the base camp light disappeared, and she was alone. She made the first radio check at the 45-minute mark, crouched behind a boulder that broke the worst of the wind, her fingers already stiff despite the double glove system. Iron Ridge, Kestrel 1. Checkpoint Alpha. Moving. Cross's voice came back immediately. Copy, Kestrel 1. Conditions? Wind's consistent with the model. Upper pass approach clear of obstruction. I'm on schedule. A pause. Then, Shaw, you doing all right out there? She noticed he'd dropped her rank designation. She chose not to examine what that meant. Moving, she said again, and released the transmit button and stood back up into the wind. She reached the ambush site 90 minutes into the climb, though she identified it before she could see it. The smell of propellant, faint but unmistakable even in the frozen air, carried downslope on the wind. 3 seconds later, her headlamp picked up the first sign, a shattered radio handset lying against a rock. The casing cracked along a seam that was consistent with it being dropped by someone moving fast and hit hard. Not thrown, dropped mid-motion. The difference mattered. She swept the area methodically, head down, moving in the slow grid pattern she'd been taught long before she'd had military vocabulary for it. The wreckage told a story if you let it. Spent brass, American caliber, 5.56, and 7.62 from a different weapon, probably a SAW. Scattered in a pattern that indicated a defensive fight with movement, the team breaking contact rather than holding position. Equipment fragments. A dropped field dressing, still in its packaging. Someone had reached for it and either decided against stopping or been forced to move before they could use it. The blood was what she needed. She found the first stain on a flat rock about 4 meters uphill from the main debris field. Dark, already frozen at the edges, but the pattern of it, the spread, the directionality, told her the wound wasn't immediately catastrophic. Too much blood for a graze, not enough for an arterial bleed. Someone was hurt, but moving. She followed the trace uphill, where 3 disturbed patches of snow told her which direction the movement had gone. Northeast would have been back into the fire. Southwest was retreat. North-northwest was the only direction that made operational sense. North-northwest toward the Vrak high ground. She felt something she couldn't have named precisely. Not quite vindication, because the situation was still deeply wrong in every measurable sense, but the particular settling feeling of a theory making contact with reality. She adjusted her bearing 2 degrees and kept climbing. The cave entrance was exactly where the Soviet survey had indicated, though in the conditions it was nearly invisible, a dark gap in a rock face that the wind had actually helped expose by scouring the snow away from the immediate approach. Warm air from the geothermal system below was mixing with the ambient temperature just enough to prevent the entrance from drifting completely shut. She smelled it before she saw it, the faint mineral warmth of volcanic rock against frozen air. She stopped 3 meters from the entrance, drew the sidearm, and announced herself clearly in a voice calibrated to carry into the cave without carrying beyond it. "First Sergeant Crow, United States, I'm coming in." Silence. Then, from inside, a sound that took her a moment to identify, because it was so unlike anything she'd expected. As a man trying and failing to hold himself together, the specific sound of someone who had been holding very still for a very long time, suddenly hearing a voice. "In here," a voice said. Low, rough, depleted in a way that had nothing to do with volume. 3 of us. 3. She exhaled once. Then she went in. The cave opened into a larger chamber 10 meters from the entrance, and the warmth hit her like stepping into a different season. Not comfortable warm, just above freezing, maybe. But compared to the world outside, it felt like something miraculous. The geothermal heat came up through the rock floor in a faint, steady radiation that had been enough to keep 3 injured men from freezing to death through a 7-hour blizzard. First Sergeant Dale Crow was sitting against the far wall, his left arm wrapped in a field dressing that he'd tied off himself, his right hand resting near his weapon in the particular way of a man who'd been on guard duty alone for hours and hadn't fully registered yet that the threat posture might have changed. Two others were behind him. Specialist Harrow, unconscious but breathing with visible regularity, a head wound dressed with someone's cut-up undershirt, and Private Garza, awake but pale, his left leg wrapped and splinted with what appeared to be a broken tent pole and two combat knives. Crow stared at her. The headlamp made everything high contrast and strange. She could see him processing what he was seeing. The civilian-issue glasses, the intelligence section patch on her shoulder, the slight build that was not what you expected to come through a blizzard alone at 3 a.m. "Shaw?" he said. Then, with the particular disbelief of a man who has run out of energy to maintain any kind of front, "You're the analyst, the terrain analyst," she said. "Yes. How long since anyone checked Harrow?" 40 minutes. "He's stable. Pulse is okay. He can't—" Crow stopped. "How did you find this place?" "Soviet Geological Survey." She was already moving toward Harrow, pulling the medical kit from her pack. "Are there more personnel? Your team had 6. Something crossed Crow's face, a specific kind of grief compressed into a single second. 3 others were in the open when the second contact happened. He stopped again. We had to move. I couldn't—" "I understand," she said quietly. She meant it. She worked on Harrow first, checking the dressing, assessing pupil response, finding both pupils equal and reactive, which was better than she'd feared, and then moved to Garza, who watched her with the steady, slightly glazed focus of someone managing significant pain. "Can you move?" she asked him. "Yes, ma'am." "Not as fast as normal?" "No, ma'am." "Crow?" The first sergeant looked at his arm. "I can move." She checked her watch. 4 hours until first light. Weather wasn't going to give them a window for rotary extraction until midday at the earliest. She pulled up the route plan in her head, adjusted it for 3 moving personnel, 2 of them compromised, and recalculated the timing in the way she recalculated everything, methodically, without drama, following the terrain logic to its conclusion. "Okay," she said. "Here's what we're going to do." She laid out the route. Crow listened with the focused attention of a professional who recognized competence when he heard it, even when the source surprised him. Garza listened with the quieter attention of a man who had decided to trust the person in front of him because the alternative was not acceptable. She pulled out the radio and keyed the transmit. "Iron Ridge, Kestrel 1. I have 3 personnel, 2 walking wounded, 1 unconscious but stable. Beginning extraction, ETA, to the wire, approximately 4 hours." She paused. "Tell Brecker he owes me a Soviet Geological Survey." Across the channel, she heard something she had not expected. Commander Cross laughed. Brief, involuntary, genuine. "Copy, Kestrel 1, he said. "We'll be here." She put the radio away, looked at Crow, who was studying her with an expression she couldn't fully read in the headlamp light, something between gratitude and a particular kind of recalibration, the look of a man revising a category he thought he'd already understood. "You came alone," he said. "Yes." "In this?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, then, "The map girl." She didn't respond to that. "I've heard people call you that," he said, steadily, not cruelly, just factually, the way someone acknowledges something that happened. "I never said it." "I know. For what it's worth—" He stopped. "Never mind. Let's move." "For what it's worth is fine," she said. "Say it." He looked at her for a second, then, "I'm glad it was you." She picked up her pack, moved to the cave entrance, checked the bearing. The wind hit her face like a reminder of exactly what was waiting between here and the wire. "Stay tight," she said. "Step where I step. If I stop, you stop. Don't talk unless it's essential. Cold air plus effort is going to cost you, and we need every calorie we've got." Crow got Garza upright. Between them they managed a stable, if slow, 3-person movement formation. Evelyn took point, headlamp forward, compass on her wrist, terrain model in her head. They moved into the blizzard. The descent started clean. Pace steady, route holding, three people moving in the kind of concentrated silence that comes from understanding that every decision matters. Evelyn tracked the wind pressure, the slope angle, the texture of the snow under her crampons. Behind her, she could hear Crow's measured breathing and Garza's occasional hiss of effort and the particular sound of men doing something difficult without complaint. They were 40 minutes below the cave when she stopped. Not because of the terrain, not because of the weather, because of the voices. Below them, maybe 200 meters down the slope, three figures had emerged from a lateral drainage channel that wasn't on her route plan, wasn't on any route plan, because it wasn't a movement corridor. It was a dry creek bed that someone with local mountain knowledge might use to approach the high ground from an unexpected direction. Three figures, moving uphill, carrying weapons. Not American weapons, not American kit. She put her fist up, closed, palm back, the universal stop signal, and felt Crow's hand on her shoulder the instant she did it, steady and controlled, telling her he'd seen them too. Nobody breathed. The figures were still moving, still coming uphill, navigating the slope with the particular deliberateness of people who knew exactly where they were going. Toward the cave. They were going back to the cave, and if Evelyn's extraction hadn't worked, if she'd been an hour slower, if the cave had still been occupied when these three arrived, the math of that outcome was not complicated. But that wasn't the problem right now. The problem was that the only route back to the wire went directly through the ground those three figures were currently crossing. Crow pressed close to her ear, barely a whisper. Options? She was already studying the terrain above the figures, already running the slope geometry in her head, already looking at the northeast face of the drainage, where the accumulated snow of 3 days of blizzard had been packed by the channeled wind into a formation she recognized, dense, wind-compressed, resting on a fractured outcrop that was doing exactly as much work as it looked like it was doing, which was not quite enough. "Give me 30 seconds, she breathed. He waited. She counted the angles. Distance to the outcrop, roughly 60 meters up and to the east. The fracture line. She could see it even in the headlamp dark, the shadow line where the snow mass separated from the rock face beneath it. The degree of loading, the trajectory if it released. She had exactly one shot to make this work, and she had never deliberately triggered an avalanche in her life. 30 seconds felt like standing inside a stopped clock. Evelyn didn't move, didn't breathe more than she had to, just stood on the slope with 3 injured men behind her and 3 armed fighters below her, and ran the geometry one more time in her head, because she only had one shot at this, and one shot was exactly what she had. The outcrop was 60 meters up and to the east, maybe slightly less, hard to judge in headlamp dark with snow reducing everything to impressions. The fracture line was real. She'd read it correctly. The mass of wind-packed snow above it had been loading for 3 days of continuous blizzard and was resting on fractured granite at an angle that a structural engineer would have looked at and immediately walked away from. The snow didn't know it was dangerous. It was just waiting for the specific argument that would change its mind. She needed to put a round into the rock face directly below the fracture point, not into the snow, into the rock, so the impact shock transferred upward through the stone and into the base of the overloaded mass. She'd never done it. Had read about it in an avalanche control manual she'd found in the base library 6 weeks ago. A dry technical document about controlled release methodology used by mountain artillery units, and had absorbed it the way she absorbed everything. Completely, almost involuntarily, because her brain was built to file terrain information the way other people filed music or faces. Reading about something and doing it in the dark, in a blizzard, with a service pistol at 60 meters while 3 armed fighters were 50 meters below her and closing, were not the same category of experience. She raised the sidearm. Crow's hand found her wrist. Not grabbing, just contact, the way experienced soldiers communicated without words. She felt the question in it. She didn't answer, just steadied her breathing, found the sighting line, corrected 3 degrees right for the wind that was pushing left at this elevation, and fired. The crack of the shot was enormous in the silence of the mountain. The figures below them froze. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then the mountain answered. It started as a sound she felt more than heard. A deep structural groaning from the rock above the fracture line. The sound of something very large deciding to move. Then the fracture released all at once, and the entire upper face of the drainage's northeast wall came down in a single mass that hit the slope below it, and immediately became something faster and larger and more violent than its component parts. The avalanche didn't slide. It dropped, and then it ran directly through the path the three figures had been occupying. The noise was absolute. The ground shook under her feet. Snow billowed outward from the impact zone in a cloud that swallowed the drainage completely, and then there was silence again. A different quality of silence, the kind that comes after something irreversible. She held the sidearm ready for a long moment, watching the debris cloud settle. Nothing moved below them. Crow exhaled slowly beside her. How did you... He stopped. Started again. Where did you learn that? Avalanche Control Manual, she said. Base library? He looked at her. You read avalanche control manuals. I read everything in the base library. He didn't have an answer for that. Neither did Garza, who was leaning against a rock and watching her with an expression she recognized from the operations center earlier, the look of someone recategorizing something they thought they'd already understood. She lowered the weapon, checked the route below, and gave the drainage a full 60 seconds before she was satisfied nothing living was going to emerge from it. We move, she said. But the next hour was the hardest physical hour of Evelyn Shaw's life, and she had benchmarks for difficult physical hours that she'd never shared with anyone at Iron Ridge. The problem wasn't her. She was moving inside her limits, uncomfortable but controlled. The problem was that 2 of the 3 men behind her were running on reserves that had been depleted for the better part of 8 hours, and the descent from the Vrock high ground was not gentle. The slope angled sharply in the middle section, a technical scramble down a frozen rock band that required hands and feet and crampons and specific sequencing, the kind of terrain that was manageable for a fit solo climber and genuinely dangerous for a group managing a leg injury and a head wound. She got them through it by talking them through it. Not reassurance. She didn't have the patience for reassurance, and Crow wouldn't have wanted it. Just specific, sequential instruction delivered in the tone of a person describing something that was going to work because she had already thought it through. Left foot here, transfer weight, right hand to this hold, don't trust the ice crust on the upper section, use the rock beneath it. Garza slipped once on the lower section of the rock band. His splinted leg buckled on a weight transfer, and he went sideways into the slope, and Crow caught him with his good arm in a movement that clearly cost him something in the injured one, and for a moment all 3 of them were pressed against the frozen rock face in the dark with the wind trying to work them off it. I've got you, Crow said into Garza's ear, low and steady. I've got you. I know, Sergeant, Garza said through his teeth. I know. They got down the rock band. It took 20 minutes for a section that should have taken 5, and at the bottom Evelyn stopped and let everyone breathe for 90 seconds, which was all the time she was prepared to give because the cold was the other enemy and stopping fed it. How's the leg? She asked Garza. Functional, he said, which meant it hurt, but he wasn't going to say so. Crow. Good. She looked at his arm, which had bled through the field dressing in the last hour. Not catastrophically. The color and quantity were consistent with a wound that was serious but not immediately life-threatening, but the dressing needed attention. Give me 2 minutes, she said, and replaced the dressing without asking him whether he wanted her to, working by headlamp with her back to the wind to block the worst of it. He didn't complain. He watched her work with the focused calm of a man who had made a specific decision about who was in charge of this situation and was comfortable with where that decision had landed. You're quick, he said. I took a field medicine course, she said. When? 3 years ago, before I joined the intelligence section. She tied off the new dressing. Before that, I did 2 years in a wilderness emergency response unit in the Northern Territories. Search and rescue, mostly. He was quiet for a moment. None of that is in your file. No. Why not? She pulled the dressing tight, smoothed the tape down. Because nobody asked. The radio check at the 2-hour mark produced a different voice than she was expecting. Not Cross, but Brecker, which meant Cross had left the operations floor for something or been pulled to command level for the kind of conversation that happened at command level when a unit had lost 3 soldiers and the search and rescue situation was unresolved. Kestrel 1, Iron Ridge, status update. 3 personnel moving, cleared the technical section, on the lower traverse now. She paused. Brecker? Yeah. Is Cross there? He's on with Brigade. A pause. He's telling them you found 3 of them. He should wait until we're back before briefing Brigade. That's not... Brecker stopped. She could hear something in his voice that she couldn't fully identify, something that wasn't quite the flat skepticism he'd brought to the operations center earlier. That's his call, Shaw. How are you doing out there? Moving? That's not what I asked. She was cold in the particular way you got cold when you'd been working hard for 2 hours in sub-zero wind. Not dangerously, but the kind of cold that settled into the joints and made everything slightly slower and heavier. Her left hand was stiffer than she'd like inside the gloves. The crampons were doing their job, but her feet had been wet for the last 40 minutes from a section of slope where the snow crust had broken through to standing meltwater beneath. And wet feet in this temperature were a variable she was tracking carefully. I'm managing, she said, which was true. Roger. Another pause. Then, with the specific awkwardness of someone saying something they hadn't prepared, for what it's worth, good work, Shaw. She released the transmit button without answering, which was petty, and she knew it and did it anyway. Crow, who had heard both sides of the exchange on her handset, said nothing for about 30 seconds. Then, he give you a hard time back there? Standard, she said. She didn't pursue it. The traverse was demanding enough without splitting her attention. The lower traverse was a long-angled shelf of mixed ice and broken rock that ran roughly parallel to the main drainage before cutting west toward the base approach corridor. In summer, it was probably a reasonable scramble route. In a blizzard at 0530 with 3 compromised personnel, it was an exercise in controlled patience, slow, methodical, reading the footing 3 steps ahead, maintaining the line of communication backward without letting it disrupt the forward movement. Evelyn walked it the way her old tracker had taught her to walk uncertain terrain. Commit to each step before lifting the previous foot, read the surface before loading it, stay low enough that a slip became a slide instead of a fall. Harrow had been conscious since the rock band. He was managing, walking with one hand on Crow's shoulder, his balance compromised by the head wound, which produced in him a particular unfocused quality that wasn't confusion exactly, but was adjacent to it. He answered direct questions with the right answers, but needed a moment to get there. He knew where he was. He knew who she was. He was cold and hurting and working very hard to stay upright. Harrow, she said without stopping. Tell me your wife's name. He blinked at her. What? Your wife. Name. Diane. He said it immediately, which was what she'd wanted. Not the name, but the speed of it. Where do you live? Fort Carson area. Colorado Springs. What'd she make for dinner on Sundays? He actually laughed. The laugh was slightly unsteady, but it was real. Pot roast. Terrible pot roast. She knows it's terrible. I've told her. She keeps making it. Good, Evelyn said. Keep thinking about the pot roast. Crow behind her made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh himself. She kept her eyes on the terrain and kept moving. They were 20 minutes from the base perimeter when the truck appeared. She heard it before she saw it. Diesel engine running rough in the cold, the particular idle knock of a vehicle that was either badly maintained or had been sitting stationary long enough for the fuel to start running thick. Then the headlights came on, low beam cutting through the blowing snow, positioned precisely at the bottom of the slope where the traverse descended to the valley floor and the only viable route back to the wire crossed the open ground. She stopped, put the fist up. Behind her, Crow went still instantly, and she felt the change in the group's energy. From exhausted moving to alert still, the shift that happened when soldiers' bodies made the decision before their brains fully caught up. The truck was a medium-weight cargo vehicle, military configuration with a ring-mounted heavy weapon on the roof that she identified by the silhouette. The ring was occupied. Someone behind the weapon, traversing it slowly in a search pattern. 2 figures on the ground on either side of the vehicle, positioned wide. Set up correctly, which meant whoever had put this blocking position together had military training and had done it deliberately, not hurriedly. 3 fighters in the avalanche below, 3 more here. The math resolved itself unpleasantly in her head. That's not one of ours, Crow said quietly, right behind her ear. No. Route options? She studied the terrain. The wire was dead ahead, roughly 200 meters past the vehicle. Left of the blocking position, the valley floor was flat and open. No cover, direct line of sight to the ring mount. Right was a drainage she'd marked on her route plan as an alternate, which would add 40 minutes and require Garza to navigate another technical section in the dark. And Garza's leg had been getting worse for the last hour, in ways he wasn't saying out loud, but that she could see in how he was carrying himself. I need to think, she said. You've got maybe 2 minutes before that mount does another sweep and catches our light signature, Crow said. Calm, factual, no pressure in it, just the reality. She killed her headlamp. Total darkness for a moment, just the wind and the cold and the distant engine idle and the specific quality of pre-dawn dark that was different from middle-of-the-night dark, a slightly less absolute quality that she'd been tracking without consciously noting it. She looked above the truck. The valley here was different from the high passes, lower elevation, different geology, the drainage pattern shaped by seasonal flooding rather than glacial action. The right side of the valley rose sharply into a limestone face that she'd noted on the terrain model because of its drainage characteristics, and the face had, she was almost certain, working from memory in the dark, a large ice formation built up across its lower section from seasonal seep water that had frozen and expanded across several winters into a structure that was considerably larger than it would appear from below. She'd noted it as a navigation marker, had not thought about it as anything else at the time. She thought about it now. The ring mount completed its traverse arc and swept back the other way. In the brief window where it was pointed away from them, she leaned close to Crow. I'm going to move left, she said, wide, toward the drainage edge. I need you to watch the ring mount. When it tracks left, I'm going to expose myself on the open floor. He was quiet for exactly 1 second. You're going to draw their fire. I'm going to draw their attention. There's a difference. There's not much of a difference if that ring mount depresses fast enough. It won't, she said. Not at this angle. The ground slope gives us 3 to 4 degrees of protection at the range I'll be standing. The elevation geometry makes a flat trajectory engagement on a low-profile target at that distance. She stopped. I've run this sector's engagement envelopes before. It's in my files. Another 1 second pause. You have engagement envelope files on this valley approach. I have engagement envelope files on every approach route in our operational sector. It's part of the terrain analysis function. Nobody reads those files, Shaw. I know, she said. I wrote them anyway. He exhaled. What do you need from me? Your rifle. And Garza behind a rock with Harrow. And when the ice comes down, you move to the wire fast. Don't wait for me. I'm not leaving. If it doesn't work, I'll be running anyway, she said. Don't wait. She felt him think about arguing and then not. The situation had its own logic, and he was experienced enough to recognize when someone else's logic was the right one. He gave her the rifle. She checked it without looking, hands working by feel, a habit from somewhere, she wasn't sure where exactly, which was itself interesting information that she filed away for a different moment. Crow watched her handle his weapon with an expression she couldn't see in the dark, but could feel. Shaw. Yeah. The map girl thing. It's fine, she said. It's not. She was already moving left, low and steady, using the natural depressions in the valley floor for cover. Behind her, she heard Crow moving Harrow and Garza to the rock outcrop she'd indicated, heard Garza's barely suppressed sound of effort as he lowered himself, heard Crow settle in behind them. The ring mount tracked left. She stood up. She was completely exposed on the valley floor, 70 meters from the truck, and she gave them 2 full seconds to find her before she broke right at a dead sprint. Not toward the truck, not away from it, but across the open ground on a lateral line that forced the ring mount to track her movement, which it did, the barrel swinging to follow, and she was counting in her head the time for the gunner to acquire and depress and fire. And the geometry was either right or it wasn't, but she'd run the numbers. She hit the base of the limestone face and went flat. The ring mount had tracked, but not fired. The depression angle either wasn't right or the gunner was hesitating, which gave her the window she needed. She was already looking up at the ice formation above her, and it was larger than she'd estimated from the terrain model, a vertical curtain of frozen seepwater 4 meters wide and at least 8 tall. The base of it attached to the rock face by a crystalline structure that had been expanding and contracting through temperature cycles for years, and was, she knew from the way it was colored at the base, no longer fully adhered to the stone beneath it. She raised the rifle. The two figures on the ground were moving now, coming around the sides of the truck, and the ring mount was swinging back to find her against the cliff face. And she had maybe 3 seconds. She fired once, into the base junction of the ice formation and the rock face, where the separation line was clearest. Nothing happened. She adjusted 6 inches right and fired again into the zone where the rock was wettest from years of seepage, softer, more fractured, and heard the round impact differently. A sound began above her, not the roar of the high pass, something more architectural, the sound of a structure deciding it no longer wanted to maintain its current arrangement. She ran. The ice came down behind her in sections rather than all at once, the formation breaking along vertical fault lines as it released, each section falling and shattering against the rock below and pushing the debris outward in a wave that crossed the valley floor and reached the truck in approximately 2 seconds, which was about 1 second more than she would have preferred, but was enough. She didn't look back. She ran hard to the right, angling toward the wire, and heard the impact. Metal against ice. The specific sound of a vehicle taking a structural hit. The ring mount going silent. And kept running. She almost missed Crow coming out of the dark toward her. "Wire's 200 meters, he said, falling into step, and she didn't answer because she was breathing too hard, and there was nothing to add anyway. Garza was moving faster than she would have bet he could. Harrow was upright and functional. They crossed the open ground between the debris field and the perimeter in something under 3 minutes, and the wire appeared in front of them with a guard post light burning yellow-orange through the snow. And she had never in her life been as grateful for institutional lighting. The gate guard, a young private whose name she didn't know, stared at them for a full second before getting on his radio. "Ah, Iron Ridge, Gate 3, Kestrel 1 is at the wire. I have," he counted. "4 personnel requesting medical and tell them walking wounded ×2, Crow said. He was breathing hard but controlled. "Harrow needs neuroassessment immediately. Garza needs ortho." The private relayed it, still staring at the group in front of him with the expression of someone who had not expected this particular moment in his guard shift. "Ma'am," he said to Evelyn, Are you okay?" She realized she must look significantly worse than she felt, which probably meant she felt worse than she thought she did. Her face was numb. Her jacket had ice crystals in the outer shell fabric. The glasses, the taped left hinge, had fogged, and then cleared and then fogged again so many times in the last 4 hours that the lenses were slightly scratched from where she'd wiped them with her glove. "I'm standing," she said, which was accurate. Crow looked at her when she said it. Something in his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same territory. The medics came at a run from the direction of the aid station, 2 of them with a stretcher that Harrow didn't want, and Crow immediately insisted he take. The medical sergeant took one look at Garza's leg and made a sound that Garza had probably been waiting to hear from someone with medical credentials for the last 4 hours. Crow, being loaded into a vehicle, reached back and caught Evelyn's arm. "You come to the debrief," he said. "That's standard procedure." "I don't care about standard procedure. I'm asking you specifically." He held her eyes. "I want you in the room when I tell them what happened out there. Everything. You understand?" She understood. He was going to make sure the record was correct, which was a different thing from the record being automatically updated. "I'll be there," she said. He released her arm. The vehicle moved toward the aid station, and she watched it go and then turned back to the gate, where the private was still standing in the particular posture of someone who had just witnessed something he wasn't sure how to file mentally. She walked past him toward the operations center without stopping. The base was waking up around her in the thin pre-dawn light. The sky still dark, but different dark. The eastern horizon beginning the barely perceptible color shift that happened before anything was visible. Personnel moved between buildings with the focused, slightly urgent energy of a unit managing a crisis. She passed 3 people who glanced at her and then double-glanced, the way people did when something didn't match the category they'd expected. She was cold in ways she'd stopped specifically tracking. Her hands needed attention. Her left foot, the wet one, needed attention. She needed to sit down and eat something and drink something hot, in roughly that order, and she was going to do all of it. But first she needed to check in at the operations center and make the formal status transmission and complete the reporting chain, because the reporting chain existed for reasons that mattered even when it was inconvenient. She pushed through the operations center door. The room was different than it had been when she left. More people, more noise, the particular busy, anxious energy of a command element managing multiple information streams. 2 additional analysts she didn't recognize had been brought in at some point, working adjacent terminals. Dodd was on the phone. Someone had brought coffee. The institutional kind, terrible. The smell of it reached her before anything else did, and she wanted it immediately. Brecker saw her first. He was standing near the main display, and he turned at the sound of the door, and for a second he just looked at her. And whatever he saw in the ice-covered, exhausted, slightly damaged version of her that had just walked back through the door produced an expression on his face that he didn't fully control before it was visible. He crossed to her, stopped 2 feet away. "All 4 personnel accounted for," he said. 3 survivors, 2 walking wounded, 1 concussion, all en route to aid station. 3 fatalities from the initial contact. Crow will give you names at debrief. She paused. "I need to make a formal status report." "I'll take it." She ran through it, the full sequence, location of contact, route taken, the blocking position, the ice formation, the current status of the personnel in the blocking position, and he wrote it down with the kind of focused attention that she was not used to receiving from him, which was itself a piece of information. When she was done, he looked at his notes and then at her. "The avalanche," he said, "and the ice formation." "Yes." "Both deliberate?" "Yes." He thought about it. "You planned that?" "The avalanche, partially. The ice formation was situational. I'd noted it in the terrain model, but hadn't specifically planned to use it." She paused. "The terrain provided options. I used them." Brecker was quiet for a moment. Not the skeptical quiet from earlier, something different, harder to categorize. "The Soviet Geological Survey," he said. "It's in my analysis files. Folder marked Supplemental Historical Source Material." "Nobody looks at those files." "I know," she said, for the second time in one night. He opened his mouth, and she could see him assembling something that was going to be significant, the kind of thing people assembled when they needed to acknowledge that they'd been substantially wrong about something, and hadn't yet figured out how to make the words come out right. She didn't particularly want to hear it right now. She was cold and tired, and her left foot needed attention, and whatever accounting happened between her and Brecker could happen when she wasn't standing in the operations center in wet gear with scratched glasses and ice in her hair. "Where's Cross?" she said. "On with brigade, he—" Brecker stopped, started over. "He's going to want to talk to you. I'll be in the equipment cage turning in gear, then the aid station, then I'll be wherever the debrief is." She turned toward the door. "Shaw." She stopped, didn't turn around. "I was wrong," Brecker said. He said it the way people said things they had rehearsed in their head, and then said slightly differently out loud because the real version was harder than the rehearsed version. "Earlier, when I was wrong." She stood with her hand on the door for a second. "I know," she said, and walked out. Chat. The equipment cage felt different on the return. Smaller, warmer. The smell of it the same institutional nylon and machine oil, but she moved through it more slowly now. The physical cost of the night settling into her body in the specific way exertion cost settled. Not all at once, but as a spreading heaviness that arrived once the acute demand was removed and the body started taking stock of what it had spent. She racked the rifle, secured the sidearm, set the radio in the charging cradle, pulled the crampons off, and found that her left boot was, as she'd suspected, significantly wetter inside than outside, which meant the next 12 hours were going to involve medical attention she'd rather skip and would not. She sat on the equipment bench for exactly 4 minutes, not to rest, just to let the room be still around her for a moment, the first stillness she'd had since the operations center at 0312. 4 minutes was enough. She stood up, picked up her remaining gear, and went to find the debrief room because Crow had asked her to be there, and she was going to be there, and because the record was going to be correct and complete. And because 6 soldiers had gone into that mountain and only 3 had come back, and that meant the night wasn't actually over yet. It was just entering a different phase, quieter and harder in a different way, the phase where the accounting happened. She found the coffee on the way, the institutional kind, terrible, in a styrofoam cup that was slightly too hot to hold comfortably. She held it anyway. The debrief room was a converted storage space on the east side of the operations building. Dropped ceiling, fluorescent tube that hummed slightly off pitch, a folding table that had seen better decades, and a collection of mismatched chairs that suggested the room got assembled in a hurry whenever it was needed. Somebody had taped a sector map to the wall with the kind of aggressive over-taping that meant they expected it to fall down otherwise. The coffee situation had not improved from the hallway version, but there was more of it, which counted for something. Evelyn sat at the far end of the table with the styrofoam cup and her field notebook and her wet left foot, which she'd wrapped in dry socks from her kit and was now simply managing as a background condition rather than an active problem. The rest of her had warmed up incrementally since coming inside. Her hands had stopped being stiff. The scratched glasses were clean. She had eaten a ration bar in the equipment cage in the 4-minute stillness and could feel it metabolizing now in the specific way emergency calories metabolized after sustained cold weather output, fast, almost impatient, like the body collecting a debt. She was the first one in the room. That was fine. She used the time to write up her field note, now simply managing as a background condition rather than an active problem. The rest of her had warmed up incrementally since coming inside. Her hands had stopped being stiff. The scratched glasses were clean. She had eaten a ration bar in the equipment cage in the 4-minute stillness and could feel it metabolizing now in the specific way emergency calories metabolized after sustained cold weather output, fast, almost impatient, like the body collecting a debt. She was the first one in the room. That was fine. She used the time to write up her field notes while the sequence was still sharp. Approach route, timing, contact points, terrain features, what she'd used and how. She wrote it in the compressed shorthand she'd developed over years of producing reports that needed to be precise without being long. Because in her experience, nobody read the long ones. Crow arrived 11 minutes later, his left arm in a proper sling now, a field dressing replaced with something more substantial from the aid station, wearing a clean base layer under his jacket. He looked like a man who had been through something serious and had reached the far side of it and was now running on the specific fuel of someone who had outstanding business to attend to before he was going to allow himself to stop. He sat down across from her, looked at the notebook. "Documenting?" he said. "Full route and contact report. I'll have it to Intel section by end of day." He nodded slowly. "How's the foot?" She looked up. "Fine. The medic told me you declined treatment. I told him I'd come back after the debrief." "That's not the same as fine." "It's manageable," she said, which was what she'd said about a lot of things in the last 6 hours, and she noticed that he noticed it. Cross came in 2 minutes after Crow, followed by Brecker and Dodd, and then a colonel she'd never met whose name she got from his name tape, Arvish, and whose presence indicated that the brigade commander was taking a direct interest in the night's events, which made sense given the numbers. 3 fatalities from Recon Team Viper. 3 confirmed hostile kills. A blocking position destroyed at the valley approach. The whole thing was going to generate paperwork that climbed several floors of command authority. Colonel Arvish took the chair at the head of the table without preamble. "Let's go," he said. "Crow. Start from Point Kestrel." Crow told it. He was a good briefer in the way career NCOs were good briefers. Economical, sequenced, clear on what he knew versus what he'd inferred, honest about the moments where things had gone wrong, and why. He described the ambush with the particular flat precision of someone who had processed the worst of it enough to report it without it breaking through the surface of the report. He described the decision to break north-northwest toward the high ground. He described the cave. He described Evelyn's arrival. At that point, Colonel Arvish looked up from his notes for the first time. "An analyst," he said. It wasn't inflected as a question exactly, more like a man reading a word in a document and needing to verify it was the word he thought it was. "Yes, sir," Crow said. "Intelligence section, terrain analysis." She came up alone. "Yes, sir." She identified our position from the initial radio contact pattern, located the geothermal feature from a historical geological source, and navigated to us independently in Category 4 conditions. He stopped for a single beat, long enough to be deliberate. She also neutralized 2 separate hostile elements on the extraction route. Arvish's pen stopped moving. He looked at Evelyn directly, which was the first time he had, with the assessing look of a person recalibrating. "Walk me through the neutralizations," he said. She walked him through them. She kept it factual and specific. Geometry, decision sequence, outcome, without reaching for language that made it sound more dramatic or less considered than it was. She could feel Brecker watching her from the left side of the table with the specific quality of attention of a person who was hearing something performed in a different register than they'd expected. When she finished, Arvish was quiet for a moment. "The avalanche control methodology," he said. "Where did you develop that?" "Base library, sir. There's a mountain artillery manual in the reference section, 1987. It covers controlled release principles for terrain denial." "And you applied it with a service pistol?" "It's a sound transfer application, not a ballistic application. The methodology doesn't require a specific weapon type. It requires an accurate read of the fracture geometry." She paused. "The pistol was what I had." Another silence. Arvish glanced at Cross, who had been characteristically quiet through the briefing, listening with the focused stillness of a man who was collecting information rather than processing it in real time. "Crow," Arvish said, "your assessment of her performance in the field." Crow didn't hesitate. "She made better decisions in worse conditions than most operators I've worked with significantly less support." He paused. "And she did it for a team she'd never worked with, in territory she'd only studied on paper, carrying a role nobody authorized her for." Another pause. "Sir?" The last word landed slightly differently than the words before it, and everyone in the room felt it. Arvish wrote something in his notes. The fluorescent tube hummed. Outside, the base was fully awake now, the sounds of it filtering through the dropped ceiling in a muffled, institutional way. Vehicles, distant voices, the general machinery of a military installation that had been running a crisis through the night and was now entering the slower, harder phase of accounting. "Shaw," Arvish said, "is there anything in your current role that uses your field capabilities?" She thought about the phrasing, field capabilities, and what it implied about how he'd categorized her in the last 10 minutes. "No, sir." "Were you aware you had them before tonight?" It was an interesting question. She considered it honestly. "I knew what I could do technically. I didn't know how it would hold under the actual conditions. There's a difference between knowing you've studied something and knowing whether it works when it needs to." Arvish looked at her for a moment longer than felt conversational. "There is," he said. "Yes." Cross spoke for the first time since the debrief started. "Colonel, I'd like to put a formal recommendation on record regarding Shaw's reassignment." "Hold that," Arvish said. "We'll get to it. First, I want the full contact report from the blocking position. I've got Brigade asking questions about the enemy element's local knowledge, and the positioning of that truck suggests someone fed them a route corridor that shouldn't have been accessible to them." The room shifted focus. Cross pulled up a sector overlay. Dodd opened a separate report on the composition of the blocking element, what they'd identified from the debris, which wasn't much, but which included a radio unit that was already with the signals section being analyzed. The debrief moved into its analytical phase, the part that was less about what happened and more about what it meant and what had enabled it. Evelyn worked her notes, answered questions when she was asked them, drank the bad coffee. At some point, she noticed Brecker, who was sitting 2 chairs down from her, had turned his notepad to a fresh page and was writing something that wasn't connected to the briefing discussion. When he caught her looking, he didn't hide it. He turned the notepad slightly toward her. He'd written, "Soviet Geological Survey, Sector 7 High Ground." What else in those files? She looked at it, looked at him. He held the notepad steady, not asking for credit, not performing anything, just asking. She took the notepad and wrote a number below his question, a file reference, handed it back. He read it and nodded once and turned back to the main discussion. The debrief ran for 2 hours and 20 minutes. By the time it concluded, the sun was actually up. Weak, northern exposure winter sun, but real light coming through the single high window of the debrief room, which felt like something. Colonel Arvish wrapped it with the specific efficiency of a man who had more stops on his day. He stood, collected his notes, looked around the table. "Good work to everyone who was in the field last night," he said. "We're going to have a harder conversation about the 3 personnel we lost. And that conversation is going to happen at Brigade with family notifications coordinated first. That takes priority over everything else today." He paused. His eyes moved to Evelyn without quite stopping. "Recommendations regarding personnel reassignment will be processed through proper channels this week. Cross, I want your written summary by 1600. "Yes, sir." Arvish left. The room decompressed slightly in his wake. Crow stood, which took more visible effort than he was acknowledging. He picked up his notes and his coffee and stopped at Evelyn's end of the table. "Aid station," he said. "I said I'd go after the debrief." "It's after the debrief." She had no counter for that. She capped her pen, closed the notebook, stood. "You did something important last night," Crow said quietly. "Not for the room. The room had mostly emptied, just for her. I want you to know I understand that. What it cost. What you had to. The decisions you made." He stopped, selected a different approach. Those weren't easy decisions. She thought about the 3 figures below the drainage and the blocking position, and the specific sound each of those situations had made when they resolved. "No," she said. "You doing okay with it?" It was a direct question from someone who was asking it because he'd been in rooms like this before and knew what happened when people weren't asked it. She thought about honest versus functional. "I'll process it," she said. "I know how." He nodded. That was enough for him. "Aid station," he said again. "I know." The aid station visit took 40 minutes and produced 2 unwelcome pieces of information. The left foot had early-stage frostnip in 2 toes, non-severe, but requiring monitoring and limited field activity for 72 hours. And she had a blood pressure reading that was higher than her baseline in a way the medic described as stress-elevated, and she described internally as, "I've been awake since 100 and triggered 2 avalanches." The medic gave her a heat pack, some paperwork, and a look that suggested she should sleep, which she intended to do as soon as the day allowed it. She was in the corridor outside the aid station, heat pack in her jacket pocket and field notebook under her arm, when she nearly walked into Lieutenant Holt. Holt was 6 months junior to her in posting, significantly louder in every setting, and had a specific habit of positioning himself near senior officers in a way that produced the impression of closeness that wasn't quite warranted by the actual relationship. He was also one of the 2 people who had laughed in the operations center when she'd said she would go alone. He stopped when he saw her. The laugh wasn't available right now. His expression did something more complicated, the particular contortion of someone assembling a response to a situation that hadn't been on their expected list. "Shaw," he said. "I heard you came back with them." "Yes?" Yeah, that's significant." He paused. "Really?" She waited to see whether there was more. Look, earlier, when He stopped, started differently. "In the ops center." "It's fine, Holt." "I laughed," he said. I know what you did," she said. "Not hard, not soft. And I know you didn't mean anything specific by it, and it's fine." She paused. "It's also not something I want to discuss in a corridor." He went slightly red, nodded, moved past her. She walked back toward the intel section. The intel section in daytime was a different environment than at 0312. More populated, more noise, the standard business of an analysis shop running its morning cycle. People looked up when she came in. Several of them had clearly already heard something. The way people absorbed base gossip was its own kind of terrain, and she'd apparently become a feature of it in the last few hours. Nobody said anything directly, but the room's relationship to her had shifted in a way that was felt rather than spoken, a slight change in the angle of attention. She sat at her workstation in the far corner and opened her files. The Soviet Geological Survey was the 3rd item in the Supplemental Historical Source Material folder, right where it had always been, in a subdirectory that showed 0 access logs from anyone other than her. She pulled up the Sector 7 documentation, cross-referenced it with the current terrain database, and started building an updated overlay that incorporated the geothermal feature network properly rather than leaving it blank. She was 20 minutes into it when Cross appeared in the Intel section doorway. He looked like a man who had been awake for 30-some hours and was operating on the particular fuel of unfinished responsibility. He also looked like a man who had several things he needed to say and wasn't entirely sure which order to say them in. Shaw? Sir? Walk with me. She saved her work and followed him out. They walked along the interior corridor toward the main operations building, Cross setting a pace that was slightly below his normal stride, which she suspected had to do with his own physical state, rather than consideration for her frostnip. Arvish is putting a commendation forward, he said. She didn't respond immediately. Okay. Formal. It'll go in your record. Okay. You're not saying anything. I don't know what you want me to say, sir. He glanced at her sideways. Most people say thank you. Thank you, she said, though they both heard the slight timing issue in it. He almost smiled. Almost. The reassignment, he said. I put a recommendation in. Crow co-signed it. Arvish approved it verbally. Written order will come through channels. She'd expected this, abstractly. Still, hearing it stated directly produced something she needed a moment to process. To what role? She said. Tactical tracking specialist. Unit level, reporting directly to operations rather than through Intel section. You'd be the primary resource for personnel recovery operations in complex terrain. He paused. You'd also help build out the methodology, documentation, training development, whatever framework you think is missing. She thought about the files nobody read, the geological surveys, the engagement envelope reports, the route analysis documents that went into the system and stayed there untouched. I'd have access to the full terrain database, she said, not just the Intel section allocation. Yes, an operational input on mission planning, not just post hoc analysis. That's what the role requires. He looked at her. Shaw, I'm offering you the job. You don't have to negotiate for things that are already in it. I'm not negotiating, she said. I'm confirming. Another almost smile. Confirmed. They stopped at the intersection of the main corridor. Cross turned to face her fully, which was something he didn't do in casual exchanges. He was a man who usually held his attention on the middle distance, even in direct conversations. And when he made eye contact with intention, it meant something. I should have listened this morning, he said, when you came to me with the signal analysis. I made you work harder than you should have had to for something that turned out to be correct. She considered several responses, settled on the honest one. You were making a reasonable call with incomplete confidence in the source. The source was sitting in my operations center with a route plan she'd already written. You didn't know what I could do. No, he said. I didn't. A pause. I do now. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she looked down at the heat pack she was turning over in her jacket pocket. Habit, the warmth of it against her palm. The 3 soldiers, she said. From the initial contact. Do you have names yet? His expression changed. We do. I'd like them. For the report. She paused. And just for myself. He understood what she meant by that second part. She could see him understand it. I'll send them to you, he said. She nodded. They parted. He turned toward the command wing. She turned back toward the intel section, and the corridor between them lengthened in the ordinary way corridors did when people walked in opposite directions. She was 30 meters from the intel section door when the operations floor erupted. Not loudly. Operations emergencies rarely started loud. They started as a sudden sharpening of tone, a rapid series of radio transmissions, a change in the quality of movement inside a room that bled through the walls before any specific words were audible. She felt it before she heard it, the way you felt a change in weather before you could name what was different. She turned back. The operations center door was open, and Dodd was in the doorway, and he was looking down the corridor with the specific expression of a man who needed a particular person immediately and had just found them. Shaw. His voice was controlled but compressed. We've got a problem. She walked back fast. What? Signals section finished the preliminary analysis on the radio unit from the blocking position. He held the door. Get in here. The operations floor was fully activated. Every terminal occupied. Cross already on the radio, 2 people she didn't recognize working a separate channel. The main display had been updated with a new overlay she didn't recognize, red markers she hadn't seen before, a timeline running in the corner. Dodd moved to the main display without slowing down. The radio unit from the blocking position, he said. It was encrypted. Signals section broke the encryption 40 minutes ago. He brought up a data window. The last active transmissions on that unit were a position report, specifically the Valley Approach Corridor, timed at 0400. She looked at the timestamp. 0400 was when she'd been 40 minutes below the cave, moving the 3 survivors down toward the lower traverse. Someone transmitted their position at 0400, she said. Yes. From inside the wire. The words landed in the room with the particular weight of something that changed the category of everything that had happened in the last 8 hours. Dodd looked at her steadily. The signal origin was localized to the base perimeter, within the wire. Someone here transmitted Viper Team's last known position and the Valley Approach Corridor to whoever was operating that blocking position. He paused. Which means the ambush wasn't opportunistic. Cross's voice cut across the room from the radio station. Shaw. He turned from the radio with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not shaken, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man updating a threat assessment in real time. The signals team has a triangulation on the transmission origin. They need someone to interpret the terrain overlay and identify the most probable location set. She was already moving toward the main display. Send me the triangulation data, she said. The data came through on her terminal 30 seconds later. Signal strength readings, timing differentials, the raw numbers of directional analysis. She opened her terrain database in the adjacent window and pulled up the base perimeter overlay, the one she'd built from base schematics and LiDAR mapping 3 months ago for a project nobody had asked for because she'd simply decided it needed to exist. She worked. The room stayed quiet around her. Not the quiet of people waiting, but the quality of quiet that happened when people recognized that someone was doing something that required the full available space of concentration, and the only respectful response was to provide it. It took her 14 minutes. When she looked up, Cross was standing 2 meters behind her. 3 probable locations, she said. Here, here, and here. She indicated them on the overlay. 2 structures and an open position along the eastern perimeter. The signal geometry eliminates everything else within the wire. The highest probability cluster is the Eastern Equipment Storage Complex, specifically the secondary structure, based on the timing differential in the signal arrays. Cross looked at the overlay for a long moment. His jaw was set in a particular way. That's the comms relay building, he said quietly. Yes, sir. Which is accessed by personnel with comms section clearance or above, she said. And anyone with a master key designation for the eastern perimeter structures. Cross picked up his radio. The room shifted into a different kind of operational mode, faster, quieter, more purposeful than the blizzard crisis had been because this was a different kind of threat, closer, colder, and more personally violating than anything that came at you from outside the wire. Evelyn looked at the overlay, at the 3 red markers on the base map, at the timestamp of the transmission that had sent a blocking position to intercept 3 soldiers who were already wounded and barely moving through the dark. She thought about the specific moment on the lower traverse when she'd heard the engine idle. She thought about Garza's leg, and Harrow's head, and Crow's arm. She thought about what the outcome would have been if she'd been 40 minutes slower, or if she'd taken the avalanche route and added the time, or if the ice formation had been 100 meters further west. The anger, when it came, was very quiet. Not hot. Cold. Which was worse. The kind that didn't burn out. She saved the overlay, formatted it as an operational report, and sent it to Cross's terminal without being asked. Then she went back to her workstation in the far corner, opened a new file, and started building the full signals correlation analysis from the raw triangulation data, because whatever was about to happen next was going to need documentation that was precise and complete and beyond any question of methodology. and she was the person who was going to produce it. Outside, she could hear Cross on the radio. The words were measured and controlled and moved fast, the language of a man initiating something that couldn't be undone. The fluorescent lights hummed. Evelyn Shaw worked in the corner and the bass moved around her, and for the first time since 0312, she was doing exactly the thing she was best at, in conditions that had finally stopped pretending they were something smaller than what they were. The signals correlation report took her 2 hours and 40 minutes to build properly. Not because the data was unclear. The triangulation geometry was actually quite clean once she'd normalized the timing differentials against the base's antenna array positions, but because she was building it to withstand the kind of scrutiny that came when a report's conclusions made powerful people uncomfortable, and that required a level of documentation that went beyond what the situation technically demanded. Every step sourced. Every assumption stated explicitly and then tested. Every alternative interpretation addressed and eliminated with specific data rather than assertion. She'd written enough reports that disappeared into the system without consequence to understand the difference between a report that was correct and a report that was correct and impossible to set aside. This one needed to be the second kind. Cross came to her workstation at the 90-minute mark to check progress, and she gave him a 3-sentence status update without looking away from the screen. He went away. He came back at the 2-hour mark and stood behind her long enough to read several pages of the working document over her shoulder, and when he left the second time, his footsteps were slightly faster than when he arrived, which she took as a meaningful signal about what he was reading. She sent the final report to Cross, Dodd, and Colonel Arvish at 10:43. At 10:51, her phone rang. It was an internal line, the kind that didn't display a name, just an extension number she didn't recognize. She answered it. Shaw, a voice she hadn't heard before. Male, measured, the particular neutral cadence of someone who'd spent years in rooms where voice control was a professional requirement. This is Major Wren, counterintelligence. I need you in conference room B in 10 minutes. I'll be there, she said. She was there in 8. Conference room B was the actual conference room, not the converted storage space. A real table, real chairs, a video teleconference screen on the far wall, currently showing a split feed that included Colonel Arvish on one side and 2 people she didn't recognize on the other, both in civilian clothes, both with the specific stillness of people accustomed to being the most significant individuals in whatever room they occupied. Major Wren was standing near the door when she entered. He was shorter than she'd expected from the phone voice, compact, with the economical movements of someone who didn't waste energy on anything that wasn't necessary. He looked at her the way counterintelligence people looked at everyone, not suspiciously exactly, but with the permanent quality of someone keeping score. Shaw, sit anywhere. She sat across from the video screen. Cross was already in the room, standing near the window with his arms crossed, which was a posture she'd never seen him take in a meeting and which told her something about his current state that his expression didn't. On the screen, one of the civilian figures leaned forward slightly. Ms. Shaw, I'm going to ask you to walk me through your signals correlation methodology. All of it. Start with the raw data inputs and don't skip steps. She walked them through it. The room listened. The civilian on the screen asked 4 questions, all of them precise and technically specific, the kind of questions that came from someone who understood what she was doing well enough to identify where an error might hide. She answered each one directly. No errors were found because there weren't any. When she finished, the civilian sat back. Your probability assessment, he said. The highest confidence location, the comms relay building. You put it at 73%. Yes. Not 85. Not 90. The signal array geometry at that location produces a confidence ceiling of 73% given the antenna positioning relative to the perimeter structures. A higher figure would be overstating what the data supports. She paused. 73% is accurate. The civilian was quiet for a moment, then to the room in general rather than to her specifically. The methodology is sound. The conclusion is consistent with what we developed independently from the SIGINT package. He looked back at her. We started working this thread 40 minutes after the signals section flagged the encrypted unit. Your analysis arrived at the same primary location set through a completely separate analytical pathway. Two independent analyses converging on the same answer, Wren said. Yes, the civilian said, which is the kind of convergence that holds up. Cross uncrossed his arms. Where are we on the physical investigation? Wren glanced at the screen, got something back that wasn't a word, just a slight change in the civilian's posture, and answered. The comms relay building was accessed at 0352 by a single individual using a master key designation. We have the access log. We have a partial on the radio equipment that matches the encryption key structure from the blocking position unit. He stopped. We're 2 hours from a complete evidentiary package. Who? Cross said. One word, flat. Wren looked at him with the steady expression of someone who was going to answer the question on his own timeline. At this point, I'm not going to name the individual in an open room configuration. He glanced at the video screen. What I can tell you is that the individual has been on base for 11 months, has comms section access, and has a pattern of after-hours system queries going back to at least month 7 that we're currently mapping. The room absorbed this. Evelyn looked at the timeline running through what that meant. 11 months. 7 months of visible suspicious pattern. 4 months before she'd arrived. The ambush on Viper team, she said. Was it the first time this individual provided route information? Wren's eyes moved to her. Why do you ask it that way? Because the blocking position was set up correctly, professionally. Whoever positioned those fighters knew the approach corridor and knew the likely extraction timing. She paused. That's not first operation execution. The placement was too confident. Wren looked at her for a moment with the particular attention of someone recalibrating. We're looking at a minimum of 3 prior incidents, he said. Possibly more. Cross's jaw did the thing it had done earlier. He turned back to the window. Evelyn thought about Viper team, about the 3 names she hadn't received yet, about the probability that those 3 soldiers had been fed to an ambush position by someone eating in the same dining facility, sleeping under the same command, accessing the same building corridors. The cold anger from earlier was still there. It hadn't gone anywhere. She just wasn't doing anything with it yet. The formal confrontation happened at 1400. She knew it was happening because the base had the quality it got when something significant was occurring in a specific room, a particular directional quality to the movement of personnel, the way people found reasons to be in certain corridors, the way the operations center felt when she passed it at 1350, like a held breath. She wasn't in the room where it happened. She wasn't supposed to be and hadn't asked to be. That wasn't her role, and she understood the distinction between the analysis function and the investigative function, even when the two had been feeding each other all day. She was at her workstation, updating the terrain database with the corrected geothermal overlay, when Crow appeared in the intel section doorway at 1427. He was in clean uniform now, sling replaced with a more minimal support wrap, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body was sending complaints that he was filing without acting on. "Come with me," he said. "I'm in the middle of—" "Shaw?" She saved the file and went. He took her to the main operations building, up a floor she didn't normally have business on, to a briefing room she'd been in exactly once before for a base-wide operations review 6 months ago. Through the door, she could hear voices, several of them, and the particular cadence of conversation that had recently been through something and was now in the aftermath of it. Crow knocked twice and opened the door. The room had Arvish, Cross, Wren, and the 2 civilians from the video screen who had apparently been physically present in the building and on screen simultaneously, which told her something about the resource level being applied to the situation. There was also a man she'd never seen before in Army uniform with a legal officer's designation who was packing documents into a folder with the efficient movements of someone wrapping up a process. And there was, in a chair against the far wall, Warrant Officer 2nd Class Teague from the comms section. She had worked with Teague exactly 3 times, all in coordination meetings. He was 34, technically competent, quiet, in the particular way of someone who preferred to operate without being noticed. He'd said 2 things she could remember from those meetings. He had good coffee in the comms section, and he'd offered it to her once, and she'd said thank you and taken it. He wasn't looking at her now. He was looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man who had crossed a line he couldn't uncross, and was now on the other side of it, where the math was different. Arvish looked at her when she came in. "Shaw, I wanted you here for this." She stood near the door. Crow stayed slightly behind her. "Mr. Teague," Arvish said, "has provided a full accounting." He said it with the particular flatness that senior officers used when they meant something specific by full, and wanted the room to understand exactly what they meant. The access logs, the transmission records, the prior incidents. He paused. 3 prior incidents, the most recent being last night. Teague's hands, on the table, were very still. "The 3 soldiers from Viper Team," Evelyn said. She wasn't asking, she was establishing the record. "Yes," Arvish said. He knew the ambush was going to happen. Arvish looked at her. "The investigation will establish the precise level of—" "He transmitted the route," she said. He tripped. He knew what the route information was going to be used for. The room was quiet. Teague's hands on the table didn't move. His jaw moved slightly, the almost invisible muscular shift of someone absorbing an accurate statement and having no counter for it. Arvish didn't contradict her. She looked at Teague for a moment. Not for long. Long enough to acknowledge that he was a real person who had made real choices with real consequences, and that she had now seen him clearly, which was different from knowing about him. Then she looked away, because there was nothing useful in looking longer. "I need the names," she said to Cross. "The 3 soldiers. You said you'd send them." "I'll send them in the next hour," he said. "Thank you." Arvish was watching her with the attentive stillness he'd had in the debrief room. The look of a man who had been revising a category all day and was still apparently finding new information to incorporate. "Shaw," he said, "I want to discuss the reassignment formalities. The written order will move today. Cross's recommendation, Crow's endorsement, my approval. But I want to make sure you understand what the role actually involves before you receive the formal paperwork." "You want to know if I'm taking it?" she said. "I want to know what questions you have about it." She thought about the files nobody read, the geological surveys, the route analyses, the engagement envelope documents sitting in subdirectories that hadn't been accessed by anyone except her in however long they'd been there. "I want operational input at the planning stage," she said, "not post hoc, before missions are finalized." "That's in the role." "Well, I want direct access to the full terrain database and historical source archive, including the classified sections I currently don't have clearance for." Arvish glanced at Wren. "Clearance upgrade is processable within 48 hours given the circumstances," Wren said. Not reluctantly, matter-of-factly. "I want a formal review mechanism for terrain-flagged route concerns," she said. "Right now, if I flag a route concern in an analysis report, it goes into the system and it's discretionary whether planning incorporates it. I want a required response protocol. Either the flag is addressed or it's formally overridden with documented reasoning." The room was quiet for a moment. Cross looked like a man hearing something he agreed with being said aloud for the first time and wasn't sure how to look about it. "That's a policy change," Arvish said. "Not a refusal, just naming it." "Yes, sir." "You're asking for structural change, not just a role change." "I'm asking for the part of the role that makes the role worth doing," she said. "If I flag a route and nobody's required to engage with the flag, then I'm still the map girl. The title changes, but the function doesn't." Another silence. Crow behind her said nothing, but she could feel the specific quality of his not saying anything, which was supportive in a way that didn't require words. Arvish looked at Cross. Cross looked at Arvish. The look between them was the look of 2 people doing a rapid calculus on institutional precedent versus demonstrated necessity. "I'll take it to brigade," Arvish said, "with my endorsement. Given the specific circumstances, the intelligence failure that enabled last night, the route flag gap that contributed to Viper Team's exposure, I think there's a supportable argument for the protocol change." "There is," Wren said, and everybody looked at him, and he shrugged slightly. "From a counterintelligence perspective, a formal route flag review protocol closes an accountability gap that this incident just made visible. I'll co-endorse it." Evelyn looked at Wren. He met the look steadily. She thought about him saying your methodology is sound to the room at 1051. The way he'd said it, not to her, but not behind her back either. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. At 1600, she was back at her workstation when the three names arrived in her inbox from Cross. No accompanying message, just the names, ranks, and hometown information for three soldiers who had gone into the mountains the night before and not come back. Sergeant First Class Owen Brackett, 36, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Corporal James Rafferty, 24, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Private First Class Mia Sung, 22, Sacramento, California. She read the names 3 times. Then she opened a separate document, not a report, not an analysis, just a blank page, and wrote them again by hand in her field notebook. Not because it changed anything, because it seemed like the minimum that honesty required. She sat with it for a few minutes. The intel section was quieter at this hour. The overhead lights had the late afternoon quality that was different from the morning quality. Same fluorescence, but the light through the exterior windows had shifted, and something in the mix of it made the room feel different. Older, maybe. More itself. Brecker came by at 16:30 with 2 coffees. He set one on her desk without asking. She looked at it, then at him. "The file reference you gave me this morning," he said. "I went through the whole directory." He pulled a chair from the neighboring desk and sat down without being invited, which was new. "Shaw. There's about 14 years of material in there. Route analysis, geological source integration, engagement envelope documentation, historical survey cross-referencing." He stopped. "I've been here 3 years. I didn't know half of this existed." "It's in the system," she said. "Nobody knew it was in the system. I wrote it anyway." He looked at her with the expression of someone who was going to say something and had decided the words they'd prepared weren't right and was now searching for different ones. "Why?" he said finally. "If nobody was reading it, why keep building it?" She picked up the coffee. It was the institutional kind. Terrible. "Because the terrain is real whether or not anyone's looking at it," she said. "Routes are real. Vulnerabilities are real. You don't stop mapping something because the people who need the map haven't asked for it yet." He was quiet. "At some point," she said, "someone asks." He looked at the workstation. At the overlay she'd been building before Crow came to get her. The corrected geothermal map that now showed the cave system properly integrated into the sector terrain database. No longer a blank spot that didn't match reality. "I was wrong this morning," he said. "I know I said it already." "You said it already," she confirmed. "I want to be useful," he said. "Going forward, if you're taking the new role, I want to understand what you've built, so I can work with it. With you." He paused. "If that's acceptable." She looked at him. He wasn't performing this. He was a person who had been wrong and had figured it out and was now trying to be accurate, and there was something she could work with in that. "Start with the Sector 7 overlay," she said. "Then the historical source directory. Read the index files first. They'll tell you what's there and why I built it in that order." "Okay." "It's going to take you a few days." "Okay," he said again. She turned back to her screen. He took his coffee and went back to his terminal, and the room had the quality it sometimes got in the late afternoon when the operational tempo dropped for a few hours, and what remained was just the work and the people doing it. Crow found her at 18:15 when the intel section had mostly emptied. He appeared in the doorway the same way he had that afternoon, looked at her across the room, and came to her workstation rather than waiting for her to come to him. "How's the foot?" he said. "Better?" This was now accurate. The frost nip was responding correctly to treatment, which she knew because she'd gone back to the medic at 1500, as promised, which the medic had clearly not expected. He sat in the chair Brecker had pulled up and not put back. "They charged Teague," he said. "Formally. He'll be transferred to a secure facility for the counterintelligence investigation, and then to military judicial." He paused. "It's going to be a long process." "I know." "The families of the 3, he stopped, started differently. "Notification is happening tonight. The colonel is doing it personally." Another pause, the specific kind that came when someone had something they needed to say and weren't quite there yet. Brackett had 2 kids. Rafferty was engaged. Sung was... He stopped again. She'd been in country 6 weeks. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that was proportionate. I've lost people before, Crow said. Not to her specifically. More like saying it to the air in the room, the way some things needed to be said aloud. It doesn't. He stopped. You think it becomes something you have a framework for, and then it happens again and the framework's not. He stopped a third time and looked at his hands on his knees and said nothing. She waited. I'm glad you found us, he said finally. Direct and specific, the way he'd said things all day. Harrow and Garza. They've got more road ahead. That's because of you. That matters. I know, she said. She meant it. He looked at her with the particular attention he'd had since the cave. You said you knew how to process it. The decisions you had to make out there. I said I'd process it. That's different from knowing how. Yes, she said. Do you? Know how? She thought about the honest answer, which was that she'd never been in exactly this situation before. Not the terrain, not the decisions, not the aftermath, and that how to process was somewhat aspirational as a statement. What she had was a history of managing difficult experiences by moving through the next necessary thing rather than stopping, and some confidence that this pattern would hold because it had held before. I'll find out, she said. He nodded slowly. It was the kind of nod that accepted the real answer, rather than waiting for a better one. The new role, he said. You accepted it. Yes. Good. He stood, moved his weight carefully. You know there are going to be people in this unit who take time with it, the adjustment. He said it evenly, not as a warning, just as information. You came in as one thing, now you're another thing. Some people adjust fast, some people are slower. I know, she said. You've been managing that for 7 months already. I have. You're better at it than I would be, he said, simply, without the performance of modesty. She looked at him. You'd be surprised. He almost laughed. Almost. Get some sleep, Shaw, he said. Brigade review is at 0800 tomorrow, and they're going to want you in the room. I'll be there. He left. She listened to his footsteps down the corridor, and then the building was quiet, except for the night cycle ventilation system and the distant radio traffic from the operations center that was always there, like background weather. She looked at the field notebook, at the 3 names written there in her own handwriting. Then she looked at the terrain overlay on her screen, the corrected Sector 7 map, the cave system properly marked now, the approach routes annotated, the geothermal feature identified with full source documentation including the Soviet Geological Survey reference. She saved the file, backed it up to the secondary archive, sent a copy to the main operations database under a new folder she created and labeled Active Reference, Personnel Recovery Terrain. She closed the notebook, put it in her desk drawer. She turned off her terminal, gathered her jacket, and stood up from the workstation in the far corner that had been her corner for 7 months, the place where she'd built a library of information about this landscape that nobody had read and that had, last night, turned out to matter more than everything else available. She put on her jacket, turned off her desk lamp. The room went dark except for the pale rectangle of the corridor light coming through the door, and she stood in it for exactly 1 second. Not for sentiment, just to let the moment be what it was before it became the past. And then she walked out. She slept for 6 hours. Not well. The kind of sleep that was more like controlled unconsciousness than rest, the body taking what it needed without asking permission. She woke at 1:30 with the specific alertness of someone whose internal threat assessment hadn't fully stood down yet, lay still for 30 seconds cataloging the sounds of the building around her, confirmed they were all institutional and normal, and then lay there for another hour, not sleeping but not fighting it either. At 02:30 she got up, made instant coffee in her room with the small kettle she'd bought 3 months ago because the walk to the dining facility at odd hours was a tax she didn't always want to pay, and sat at her small desk with the field notebook and worked through what she knew and what she still needed to know and what the brigade review at 0800 was going to require from her. By 0430 she had a clear picture of it. By 0600 she was showered and in uniform and back in the intel section with the overhead lights on full, working through the final documentation pass on the signals correlation report, because Wren had told her counterintelligence would be presenting it at brigade alongside her analysis, and she wanted it to be exactly right, which was a different standard than approximately right, even though in most situations they were functionally indistinguishable. Brecker came in at 06:45. He looked at her, looked at the coffee situation. "Did you sleep?" he said. "Some." He went to get coffee without saying anything else, which she appreciated. Bad. The brigade review started at 08:03 because the general's vehicle had a mechanical issue that nobody talked about directly, but that produced a 3-minute delay, acknowledged only as the general will be momentarily late, and then absorbed into the normal operations of a room full of people who were professionally accustomed to adjusting. Brigadier General Hask was 61, physically compact, with the unhurried movement of someone who had made enough decisions under pressure that pressure no longer changed how he moved. He came into the conference room without ceremony, took the head chair, and looked at the assembled personnel with the specific economy of a man who intended to understand something thoroughly and didn't plan to be here all day. There were 12 people in the room. Evelyn was the most junior by several pay grades. She was also the only one who had been at elevation in a blizzard 24 hours ago, which the general appeared to be aware of because when his initial survey of the room reached her, it stopped briefly before moving on. Cross briefed the night's events in the compressed, sequential style of someone who had been briefing generals long enough to understand that completeness and brevity were not actually in conflict if you were precise about what mattered. He covered Viper Team's loss, the response, Evelyn's role, the extraction, the blocking position, and the signal's intelligence discovery in 18 minutes. He did not editorialize. He stated what happened and what it meant. Hask listened without interrupting. When Cross finished, the general was quiet for a moment. "The Analyst," he said. "Shaw." "Yes, sir," Cross said. Hask looked at her directly. "Walk me through the signal analysis. The original one. The radio transmission pattern." She walked him through it. Same as she'd walked Arvish through it. Same as she'd walked Wren through it. Same as she'd explained it to Cross in the operations center at 03:12 yesterday, while Brecker was looking at her the way people looked at things they didn't believe. She said it the same way each time, because the analysis was the analysis, and it didn't improve with performance. Hask nodded once when she finished. "And you planned the route before you presented it?" "Yes, sir." "How long did that take?" "About 90 minutes, from the time the radio blackout was confirmed to when I went to the commander." "You were running terrain analysis on a sector you knew from your regular work?" "I'd been studying that sector for 4 months, sir. It was my assigned area." "You studied geothermal features from a 1970s Soviet survey." "It was in the historical source archive. The feature was real. It seemed worth knowing about." Hask looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not the recalibration look that Arvish and Cross and the civilians had been wearing in various versions for the last day, but something slightly different, slightly older, like a man recognizing a pattern he'd seen before from a different angle. "It wasn't in your assigned research parameters," he said. "No, sir." "You did it anyway?" "Yes, sir." He looked at Cross. "The reassignment recommendation." "On my desk as of yesterday evening," Cross said. "Arvish has approved. I was waiting for this review before submitting to Brigade for formal processing." "Wren co-endorsed it," Wren said from 2 seats down, without inflection. Hask was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table, then at Evelyn. "Shaw," he said, "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I'd like a direct answer." "Yes, sir." "Why is your emergency response and search and rescue background absent from your personnel file?" The room was quiet. It was the question that had been sitting in various people's peripheral vision for the last day without being asked directly, and the way Hask asked it, without accusation, but without softness either, made it clear he'd read something about her history somewhere, or had someone read it for him, and had decided the gap between what the file said and what the last 24 hours had demonstrated was worth addressing. She'd thought about this answer, not because she had something to hide, she didn't, but because the honest version of it was slightly more complicated than the answers she usually gave. "When I came into the intelligence section," she said, "the posting was for terrain analysis. Specifically, that's what the role required and what I applied for. My prior field experience wasn't relevant to the role as defined." She paused. "Nobody asked about it." I didn't volunteer it because I wasn't sure it would be received well. A terrain analyst with emergency rescue background in a unit that had existing personnel recovery assets looked more like a liability than an asset to me, someone who was going to second-guess operational decisions. So you kept it out, Hask said. I kept it separate, she said. It's in my general service record. It's not hidden. It's just not in the role-specific file. Because you made a judgment call about how it would be received. Yes, sir. He looked at her for a moment longer. That judgment call cost us 7 months of capability we didn't know we had. She held his eyes. Yes, sir. It did. He didn't break the eye contact and neither did she, and the room sat in it for a full 3 seconds before he looked down at the documents in front of him. The policy change request, he said. The route flag review protocol. Yes, sir. This from Cross and Arvish almost simultaneously. Walk me through the argument for it, Hask said. Evelyn answered before either of them, because it was her argument and she was the one who'd built it. The intelligence failure that enabled the Viper team ambush was partially enabled by a route exposure gap. The Sector 7 corridor had been flagged in analysis reports as a pattern of life concern 6 weeks ago. That flag was in the system. It wasn't incorporated into the patrol planning because there's no requirement to engage with terrain flags. They're advisory, and in a high operational tempo environment, advisory inputs get deprioritized. She paused. A required response protocol doesn't prevent commanders from overriding the flag. It requires them to acknowledge it and document the decision to proceed anyway. That's accountability without removing authority. Hask looked at the document in front of him. Her policy proposal, she realized, which Arvish must have forwarded. He'd read it before this meeting. You wrote this in an afternoon, he said, after coming off a 6-hour field operation in a blizzard. I wrote the framework in an afternoon, she said. The underlying argument has been building for 4 months. He set the document down. Approved, he said. In principle, Ren, I want counterintelligence to co-develop the protocol language. There's an accountability chain element here that overlaps with your function. Understood, sir, Ren said. Cross, the reassignment order goes through today. Yes, sir. Hask looked at Evelyn one more time with the expression she still couldn't fully categorize, the one that was different from everyone else's. She understood it, eventually, as simply recognition. Not the discovering kind, not the recalibrating kind, the seeing clearly kind. The kind that didn't require revision because it hadn't started wrong. Well done, Ms. Shaw, he said, and turned to the next item on the agenda, Satsum Mants. The formal reassignment order came through at 1340. Cross handed her the paper copy in the corridor outside his office. Not a ceremony, just a document passing between 2 people. And she read it twice and folded it and put it in her jacket pocket next to the heat pack she no longer needed but hadn't emptied. New workspace is being set up in the operations building, Cross said. East Wing, adjacent to planning. You'll have a terminal with full database access and a direct line to the planning section. When? End of day today. She nodded. Shaw. He stopped. Looked at her with the specific look he'd been refining since 0312 yesterday, the one that had started as tactical assessment and become something more personal over the last 30 hours. I want to say something and I'd like you to let me finish it. Okay, she said. I've commanded this unit for 14 months. In 14 months, I've processed a lot of personnel assessments, a lot of capability evaluations. I thought I was reasonably good at reading people. He stopped. I was not good at reading you, and that failure, that specific failure, almost resulted in 3 additional casualties on top of the ones we already suffered. He paused. That's on me. Not on the institutional structure, not on how you presented yourself. On me. And I'm telling you directly because I think you deserve to hear it directly. She looked at him. He meant it. The discomfort in it was real. Not performed accountability, but actual accounting, the kind that costs something. I appreciate that, she said, and meant it. Okay, he said, and walked away because Cross was a person who said things that needed to be said and then moved on, which she respected. She stood in the corridor for a moment with the reassignment order in her pocket. The east wing was 40 meters down and left. Her old workstation was 20 meters right. 14 years of terrain analysis files were in the system under her login credentials and would follow her to whatever terminal she sat at next. She went left. Harrow was discharged from the aid station at 1600. She knew because Crow sent her a message. One line. Harrow's out. Walking. Asking for food. She read it at her new workstation, which still smelled of cleaning product and had a keyboard that was slightly stiff from disuse, and felt something in her chest that was small and warm and specifically shaped like relief. She went to the dining facility at 1730. She went because she was hungry, and because the alternative was another ration bar, not because she was looking for anything social, and she was 3 minutes into the meal when Garza appeared with a tray and the particular slow, careful movement of a man whose repaired leg was functional but still communicating its opinions about things. He saw her. Stopped. "Ma'am," he said, "can I—" He gestured at the empty seat across from her. "Sit down, Garza," she said. He sat, arranged his tray, started eating, and they ate in silence for a few minutes in the way people ate when they'd been through something together and didn't need to construct conversation around it. "I heard about the new role," he said eventually. "Yes. Tactical Tracking Specialist." He said the title the way people said new things they were trying to understand the shape of. "That's—" He stopped. "Is that what you wanted?" She considered it. "I wanted the work to be used," she said. "The role is what makes that possible." He nodded, pushed food around his plate. "At the cave," he said. "When you showed up, I didn't—" He stopped. "I heard Sergeant Crow say your name, and I didn't know who you were." "I know. I'd been in the mountains for 8 hours. I was pretty—" He made a gesture that covered all of it. "And then this person comes in from the blizzard, and she's got the same patches as the intel section and taped glasses, and I thought—" He stopped himself, looked slightly ashamed of the direction the thought had been going. "What did you think?" she said. Not pointed, just asking. "I thought we were done," he said. Not that you weren't real, just that the help wasn't going to be enough. That whoever they sent wasn't—" He stopped again. "I was wrong. You were in a cave after 8 hours in a blizzard with 2 injured teammates," she said. "You weren't in a position to assess much. Still," he held his fork and looked at the table. "I want you to know that I know what it took, what you did." He looked up. "Brackett was my friend. Rafferty I knew. Soong, she'd only been here 6 weeks. He stopped. The stop was different from the other stops. Longer. "What you did didn't bring them back, but you got us back. And I want you to know I know those are different things, and one of them doesn't cancel the other." She set her fork down. "I know," she said. He exhaled. "Thank you. That's all. That's the whole thing." She looked at him. Young, 23 probably, sitting across from her in a dining facility with a repaired leg and a tray of food, and the particular quality of someone who was alive in a way they were actively aware of. "You're welcome," she said, and meant that completely. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon that was overcast and cold without being dramatic about it, Evelyn was in the planning section going over a route assessment with the patrol leader for an upcoming reconnaissance mission when Wren appeared in the doorway and waited for her to finish. She'd learned what Wren's different kinds of waiting looked like. This one was not urgent. She finished the briefing, confirmed the patrol leader had the updated overlay with the flagged sections marked, and went to the door. "Trial starts Monday," Wren said. They were in the corridor now, voices low from habit rather than necessity. "Teague's case. The JAG office finished the evidentiary package yesterday. It's complete. The SIGINT evidence, the access logs, the prior incident documentation." He paused. "Your analysis is in the record, the signals correlation report. It'll be entered as evidence." "I know," she said. "JAG contacted me last week. They may call you to testify." "They told me that too." He looked at her. "You okay with that?" She thought about the question. About the conference room and Teague's hands on the table, very still. About Brackett, Rafferty, Sung. About the 3-minute drive from the briefing about their families to the briefing about what happened next. Yes, she said. It's going to be public record, he said. Your role, the analysis, the field actions. All of it will be in the trial record, which is, it's going to get attention. I know. How do you feel about that? She looked at him. Wren was careful with his questions in the way counterintelligence people were careful with everything, choosing what to ask and how because the asking itself was never neutral. This question felt different from his professional ones, more like something he actually wanted to know. I feel fine about the record being accurate, she said. I don't have feelings about the attention. He nodded slowly. The general cited your work in his sector assessment report. Arvish submitted the protocol change for theater-wide review. It may end up as a broader policy standard. She didn't say anything to that. It was information she'd process later, in private, where she didn't have to perform a response to it. You built something, Wren said. The library you built. The terrain files. People are reading them now. Brecker's team has been working through the historical source archive for 3 weeks. Planning section pulled 6 of your route analyses for the upcoming operation cycle. I know, she said. Brecker sends me questions. Every day? Every day, she confirmed. Wren almost smiled. Good, he said. Then, with the directness he applied to everything, the files you built when nobody was looking, those turned out to matter more than the ones people commissioned. You know that. The terrain was always real, she said, whether or not anyone was reading about it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, not the small professional nod, but something more deliberate, and walked away down the corridor. On a Friday in the 3rd week, Crow found her in the planning section at 07:30 before anyone else had arrived for the morning cycle. She was at the main terrain display, updating the Sector 8 overlay with geothermal corrections she'd been building from the same Soviet archive that had produced Sector 7. He stood in the doorway and looked at the display and then at her. There's more of them, he said. The geothermal features. 4 more in the operational sector, she said. Potentially 2 outside it that are worth noting for contingency planning. He came in, stood next to her and looked at the display the way he looked at terrain, reading it, not just seeing it. How long would it have taken someone to find these if you hadn't already built the archive? She thought about it honestly. The Soviet survey is declassified, but not digitized. Someone would have to know to look for it, know where to access it, and have the terrain modeling tools to integrate it with current database. And the time. She paused. Months, maybe, depending on priorities. But you'd already done it. I'd already done it. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the base was beginning its morning. Voices, vehicles, the gradual activation of a unit starting its day. I've been doing this job for 14 years, Crow said. I've never once gone to the intel section and asked what was in the historical archive. Not once. He said it without self-flagellation, just factually, the same way he said everything. That's a gap, a real one. It's a cultural gap, she said. Analysis and operations talk different languages and usually across a wall rather than through a door. Your new role breaks that down. That's the intent. He looked at her. Is it working? She thought about the last 3 weeks, about the planning section pulling her into briefings before missions were finalized rather than after. About the patrol leader yesterday who'd come to her desk voluntarily to ask about a drainage feature she'd flagged on the Sector 8 overlay. About Brecker, who now sent her questions every day and had started asking them in slightly better technical language, which meant he was learning the vocabulary. It's starting to, she said. He nodded, looked at the display again, then at her. When I told you I was glad it was you, he said, in the cave, I want to make sure you understood what I meant. I understood. Not because you were the option available, because... He stopped, restarted. I've worked with a lot of people, a lot of operators, specialists, analysts, support, and the ones who do it right, not perfectly, there's no perfectly, but right. They're the ones who keep working even when the work isn't being seen. You kept working. For 7 months, in a corner, with files nobody was reading. He paused. That's the kind of thing that saves lives. Not the dramatic version. Not the moment in the blizzard, though that mattered too. The 7 months before the blizzard. That's what actually saved us. She looked at the terrain display. At the corrected sector map with the cave system properly marked, the approach routes annotated, the geothermal network documented with full sourcing. The blank space that had been there before, the place on the map that didn't match reality, now filled in. It needed to be there, she said, whether or not anyone was looking at it. I know, he said. That's what I mean. They stood together in front of the display for a moment. Two people looking at a map of a place they both knew from different angles and had both crossed in the dark, for different reasons, in ways that had converged at the exact moment they needed to. Then Crow straightened up. "Oh, 800 planning cycle," he said. "I know. I'll be there." He left. She turned back to the display and made 2 small corrections to the Sector 8 overlay. Notation adjustments, source citations that needed to be more specific, and then stepped back and looked at the whole thing. The mountains were still there. The terrain was still real. The features that mattered were now visible on the map, documented and sourced and integrated into the system where the people who needed them could find them. She saved the file. The operations building was filling up around her. Footsteps in the corridor, voices in adjacent rooms, the morning radio traffic beginning its cycle. She could hear Brecker's voice somewhere down the hall, on a call, asking a question that used terminology she'd taught him 2 weeks ago. She picked up her coffee, terrible, institutional, lukewarm by now, and drank it anyway, and went to work. The Teague trial lasted 11 days. His conviction came on a Wednesday, on 4 counts, including 3 related to the prior incidents that had not yet been publicly attributed to him. The sentence was substantial, and it was public, and it was, by every measure she applied to it, proportionate to what had been done. She read the verdict in a brief message from Wren. 2 sentences, nothing more, and sat with it for a minute at her desk. Then she filed it in the same mental folder as everything else from that night. Not closed, exactly, but settled. The kind of thing that doesn't go away but stops being the loudest thing in the room. Brackett, Rafferty,